Okay, it's set. Okay, yeah, okay, recording started. Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome Santhi Corcoran here today. Santhi's going to talk on culture, society and human rights, a reflection on inclusion, belonging and creating community. And a brief background on our speaker here today. Santhi Corcoran is a lecturer and doctoral researcher in Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick. She has a professional background in healthcare, social care, social psychology, regeneration and community development. She teaches both undergraduate and postgraduate courses in sociology of education, global citizenship, migration and intercultural studies and postgraduate programs in cross-cultural psychology. Her research interests are in the field of intercultural competence, ethics, psychology, intercultural dialogue, global citizenship, education and diversity. She has contributed to health, education and migration research and developed programs and services for displaced communities both in the United Kingdom and in the Republic of Ireland. Santhi is a member of the Anna Lindh Foundation in the EU, which promotes intercultural education for youth and dialogue perspectives, an interfaith programme of the Leo Baeck Foundation, a German federal government fellowship. She is also the co-founder and co-chair of the Midwest Migrant Community Network, MWMCN, based in Limerick, Ireland. This is a not-for-profit social justice and social action network that works with representatives from education institutions, community projects, NGOs, youth services and local organisations to promote community integration. So I'll hand it over to you there, Santhi, and you're more than welcome. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks very much for inviting me to present today, both to Patricia Kieran and Carly Garcia. The presentation I'm about to do is a kind of broad thoughts and reflections that I have about culture, society and human rights. And I'll start by sharing my slides with you. So my premise, if you like, for what I would like to share with you today is, first of all, a personal reflection on culture, society and human rights. And I'd like to explore that in terms of the complexity of culture, society and the appreciation of intercultural awareness, and also hopefully a little discussion on the concept of human rights. In a world where rights and reality often, unfortunately, collide. We, on the 10th of December, will be celebrating International Human Rights Day, so I felt this was a very important and appropriate conversation and an observation of the importance of intercultural competence in creating and developing inclusive communities. So to start off, I mentioned a personal reflection. And this personal reflection is very much linked to my family history of colonialism, occupation, conflict and displacement. And it really fuels my commitment to human rights. And it's a legacy that really inspires my activism and my work, and has been for the last 30 years. My parents are survivors of war. They were children who were survivors of war. My mother was a war orphan. She lost both her parents, who were clinicians in the war, and was raised by, thankfully, by her godfather and uncle, who is the only grandparent I knew. My father was displaced as a child during conflict and from his parents for a period of time. So he was thankfully looked after and taken care of by family members while he was displaced from his family. So I have a real personal understanding of what war and conflict and displacement means from both my parents and my uncles and aunts, who were their siblings. My parents also were children that grew up during the period of colonialism. And of course, just before, during the conflict and before occupation by an outside nation. So it's a very strong history and legacy in my family. We have, all of us, descendants of our parents and others, been made to understand the impact it has and the implication it has for community, for society, for human life and humanity. So that's kind of my personal reason, if you like, for the work that I do and my interest in academia in terms of intercultural awareness and cultural work. So I just wanted to explore a little bit about culture before I went forward. It's a very difficult area to define. The term culture, what is culture, has so many intricacies to it and complexities to it, and that's and therefore definition of it has always been a contested argument. It's a busy space in terms of what it means, but it also is an area that has many different perspectives and perceptions of it. And because of it, it's often difficult to give a very clear and specific definition of what it means. Hofstede, I think, came close in talking about it as a collective phenomenon that, distinguishes one group or category to another. But I often think that's quite a language. If you look at it linguistically, I feel sometimes it's a bit divisive, because culture is so much more. It is the language that we speak, or the language that we inherited, but may actually be one of the many languages that we speak. It's about how we communicate with each other. It's about the courtesies we apply in our daily lives, and the rituals that we hold sacred, the roles and responsibilities we have, the customs that are significantly important and is often adhered to and robustly applied in our appreciation and representation of our culture. It's about relationships. How do relationships work? And within that relationship, where are those roles? What are the gender roles? What are the roles of the elders? What is the role of people within that in terms of children? The practices that we apply and link to those roles, rituals, courtesies, the communications and customs. The expected behaviors, how we should be, and the kind of invisible, hidden behaviors that are, expected but not often communicated. The values and thoughts that we apply to our decision making, to how we see the world, and how we interact with each other. All of these are just the many nuanced aspects of culture. So, in a sense, culture is a very difficult thing to identify as a specific thinking or a specific way of being. Culture also has characteristics. I once asked a group of young people that I was working with in a youth program, is everybody got a culture, or can anybody be culture free? And it was a long conversation, and probably one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had, because they talked about identity. My culture is my identity, but it doesn't necessarily mean what I speak, what I do, what I pray to is part of that identity. So there was a lot of real interesting unpacking of what young people thought of the identity. The fact that we are who we are and what we are within a given society. They felt that linked into their culture, and who belonged and who didn't. The diverse and varied aspects of culture, even within communities and between groups. And we often think of differences in culture as that culture and my culture. But actually often within a cultural group, there can be significant diversity. And we know that Ireland has significant diversity within its own, indigenous culture. The difference from group to group, that is there, but also the commonalities that we hold, the truths that we hold, things like what we believe, what we value, how we rear our young, all those things that sometimes come together as almost a collective an interesting aspect of what's similar about us rather than what's different about us. And so when Hofstede talks about those, a commonality, those aspects that are different about us, I often say there's so much that is similar about us. We just don't often look at that similarities as much as we look at our differences, which, is a shame in a sense. We talked about learned behavior and behaviors that are subject to change and influence. And that was interesting because I remember one young person said to me, well, I'm an atheist, so I don't have any culture or faith. And I said, that's great. So what do you apply to your daily thinking, to your rights and wrongs, etc. And he went on to talk about what for me was a list of real values and real principles And at the end of it, I said, so you have beliefs? And he said to me, I've just identified what any other person with a faith would have said, these are my values. And I said, interestingly enough, I said, I always say nobody is culture free. We're either part of a culture, we're part of a culture we've developed. I mean, we can, we grow and we evolve and we change our minds, we have free will. And within that free will comes that opportunity to create what we feel is culturally appropriate and within context to how we live our lives. So that was an extremely interesting conversation to have with young people, and to think and reflect on some of the discussions we had. But we also talked about a number of other things, and I've had this discussion with a number of different groups, about dimensions of culture and society that has an impact on our everyday lives, but also on our human rights. For example, the things that impact on our culture and society. I mean, we take so much from architecture worldwide. We look at beautiful architecture and say, oh, we'd like to have that in our home, in our buildings, representing a specific event that denotes humanity. Art that we use to express ourselves, music, dance, the crafts that we, that identify our culture, our ancient culture, our contemporary culture. Fashion quite often borrows significantly from cultural aspects, and the food that we all enjoy. I once asked a group of people, what are their favorite foods? And they listed it, and I said, can you identify how many aspects of this food is about your culture? And of course it wasn't. We are so globalized and we've traveled so much and we are so open to the diversity in our society that we sometimes don't realize how globalized we are as people, how diverse we are as people in terms of our food, our tastes, our way of being, how we dress, even how we actually believe in our spiritual context. So, the impact of culture is significant in terms of not just faiths and beliefs and language and symbols, but also in the more broader societal aspects of life. And culture has contributed to the creation of remarkable civilizations. We know of it, we've visited some of them, we admire and are in awe of some of them. But it's also created by creating borders and boundaries, discrimination and prejudice and intolerance of others. And also that concept of ethnocentrism, and xenophobia, the fear and the sense of better than others, has contributed to the oppression of others and the subjugation of others and the colonization of people. It has instigated wars, conflicts, and our borders and boundaries have often been interesting spaces. We don't often see our society, our civilization evolving as a coterminus to mankind, but more coterminus to other countries, other nations, other borders. So in a sense, keeping and encapsulating who we are within a specific space, rather than seeing where did those connections begin? How did we become who we are and where we are? And did we originally have those very special links that we've now, through our borders and boundaries, lost to each other? So how does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights then work in the 21st century? I mean, this is something that we, it was very important and integral part of us coming out of the Second World War. It was adopted in 1948. It had the best will in the world in terms of looking at how do we go forward as people? How do we go forward and prevent the wars and conflicts that we had? How do we become more peaceable? How do we work with each other? But actually, we have evolved significantly since then. We've become, the UN itself is more diverse. The states are no longer only political actors. They have to deal with a number of things, the supranational, the transnational, local actors who generate, reconstruct, or challenge the existing normative assumptions. And, international human rights law is now not the only normative order. There are other non-legal options, such as customary, religious, social and cultural norms. They're all invoked to uphold fundamental human rights. And this is where it becomes quite ambiguous sometimes and quite different in terms of who how and in which way it's applied, and how the original signing up and adoption of it has changed significantly since. So there are changes to the universality of what UDHR intended to be, because societies across the globe have changed. The world has changed, the way we think has changed. We have crossed borders and boundaries more. We have lived in each other's shoes more. We have actually become more diverse people. So our understanding and appreciation of rights, and particularly in terms of gender equality, has enabled and empowered us in so many ways. It's provided us with rights that rightfully should have been there. But the interpretation of the concept of human rights is very much of the individual and their liberty. So it was always designed to the rights of the individual, the rights of a person, the right of, a person's liberty. And it wasn't always in its early concepts appreciated or applied to the cultural and philosophical traditions of non-Western and emerging Indigenous societies. And in some instances, Indigenous societies particularly have not benefited as much from UDHR as much as broader societies who had the means and the opportunity to apply it and had the lobbying and campaigning that was needed to raise awareness of the rights of others. So there was a human rights memorandum in 1947 that talks about rights of people, but then if you look at it in context of today, and some of the work that UNESCO has done, they've highlighted that that we must not neglect the fact in other worlds, human rights theories have emerged, are emerging, and are going to continue to develop and emerge. So that has to be constantly reflected and looked at and reviewed. So what was fundamental human rights has, in a sense, become an important document to be reevaluated in terms of what's happening in the world and who is most challenged by it, who is most marginalized, who is most disenfranchised by it. So it's not a document that is there as just, I believe, or in my opinion, to just guide in terms of providing us with tools or understanding of rights, but it should be a growing and evolving document addressing the changes in society. And it has done that in many ways, for example, in terms of disability rights, for example, which came very late into play in terms of rights and responsibilities. And we're still looking at issues such as gender rights. But I think, in a sense, what was a document that really provided us with a foundation, I think needs to really meet the challenges that I think the 21st century world, and particularly now with all the issues that are in front of us, from COVID to other conflicts and on border issues, from Belarus to Poland, which was recently in the frame, to the problems we're having in Calais with migrants, and undocumented migrants particularly do not benefit from any UDHR laws and legislation. So there is a lot still in that conversation, and it's a conversation that is going to continue to be quite busy and quite contested. So these are some of the spaces where rights and reality collide. I had the privilege of working with Professor Marie Parker Jenkins some time ago, and we looked at cultural identity and religious freedom and at odds with state law, laws and the interpretation of rights. And one of the things we looked at was in France the struggle to balance a policy of secularism with religious freedom and laws forbidding conspicuous religious symbols. So, wearing the hijab. So we looked at how this increasing Islamophobia, for example, and xenophobia in the West, and really quite often the gender discrimination that's applied, increased intolerance directed at women who choose to wear Islamic dress. And women do choose to wear them. In some instances, it is because of their cultural affinity and their, they want to represent their culture. In other instances, because it's a sense of, if you see me in this negative space, I'd like to show you that this is not a negative expression of myself. So garments being considered in some instance in the current political discourse as articles of radicalization, even proselytizing, has been used in a very difficult and negative form towards particularly women who are more representative of those garments, in terms of how they wear it, how they apply it, when in fact, it's a cultural expression. So if we are looking at the articles that Universal Declaration highlighted, then we have the right to freedom of thought and religion, the right to, change that belief, the right to represent that and manifest that in our teaching, our practice, our worship, our observance. So Article 18, which clearly, gives us that right in many ways, is contradicted by some of the legislation that actually then applies these negative stereotyping, which is often based on xenophobia, fear, and misinterpretation. So while they are rights that are there to enable and support us in allowing us to be who we are and what we are, there have also been aspects of those rights that have been in breach because it has been misinterpreted and misapplied in terms of more political and societal change of mind or mindset towards what that represents. So what could create a common ground? Common grounds are another very difficult collaboration to achieve. We all have, or we all come to the table with our own views, our own opinions, our own agendas, our own sense of what is right and wrong. So creating common ground is in itself a long and a complicated, but actually I think quite a worthwhile effort. In a global civilization where complexity is the norm, we can't ever get away from that. A challenge is apparent, I believe, for some societies in bringing together aspects of diverse cultural expression with the universality of UDHRs and how we apply that and coexist with that in society. So human rights violations are more likely to be avoided, I think, through how we develop and adopt intercultural awareness, a sense of cultural humility, and how we apply that in our communication practices. Because just knowing about cultural aspects isn't going to allow us to be able to practice it and communicate it in a way that, creates that opening for discussion and discourse and learning from each other. Having some cultural humility is important, I think. And how we actually communicate in the first place. How do we use language? How do we, introduce ourselves to someone who is from a different culture and create that opening of a friendship to creating learning for both of us. Intercultural citizenship is an important element, I believe, in education. And as we are in an education institution today, I think the way that we use intercultural citizenship in education, in working with young people, in working with those who teach young people, is a tremendous way of transcending divisiveness in society and creating that inclusion, that concept and understanding of inclusion that is important. So why does intercultural awareness matter now? I think it helps us and supports us in our understanding of diversity. It gives us tools, I think, and skills that we need to function and thrive in a multicultural, intercultural, multi-faith environment. So whether it's education, healthcare, business environments, engagement with community groups, we need this. And people in the business environment particularly have really moved forward in trying to understand this and in healthcare. And I think equally in education, this is a very important application, whether we're training people to be educators or training people to go out into the world to work with diverse communities. And the work that they can do with others that they train and educate. It helps us to study, work, live, and engage with others, and create a meaningful society where we actually can coexist with respect and understanding. And it helps us, develop and promote that sense of belonging and unity. And belonging is very important, particularly to the young people that I work with and I talk to. That sense of being in two worlds, and even what's now known as third culture kids, kids with more than one of those aspects to their lives, for them to feel a sense of belonging. This is home, this is where I belong. I am of many, but I am also of this nation. That is really important to young people, and sometimes that's the difficulty that they have. And I think creating that sense of belonging and unity is very, very important. So like any aspects of application that we use in everyday life, there are variables that are going to contribute to the positiveness of it, and there are going to be variables that hinder that progress. So I was thinking of things like mindfulness in what we do and what we say, awareness of ourselves and others, so knowledge and respect. Creating listening skills, not just being able to communicate, but being able to listen, to hear what is being said, not just what is being spoken. Our positive attitudes towards each other, to have empathy and, being open to this concept of lifelong learning, because every journey creates new learning. And the complexity of culture and diversity, that it is not an easy nut to crack, and it's important to really work with those different skills and tools to appreciate that it's cognitively a real complex area. So if that's the positive elements that we can develop, what are the things that hinder? And we know ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism and discrimination all contribute to that relationship, that meaning making that won't happen. And that's quite often linked to fear. Fear contributes to all of those above, and fear of the unknown, fear of difference. But human behaviour can be subject to change and free will, as I've mentioned earlier. But sometimes that mindset can be unyielding, particularly about stereotypes. So it's a lot of work that I think often needs to be done around the issue of not just bias and racism and discrimination and prejudice, but also stereotypes, because stereotypes contribute to that. And it's almost as if we don't address those, we're not going to get past what people may, visibly say, yes, I appreciate what you're telling me and what you're teaching me, and I need to apply this. But hidden, there are depths to people that's invisible in terms of really values, beliefs, and attitudes they've developed from experience, from exposure to incidences where there's been misinterpretation, and that stereotypes sit. So it's really important to actually understand that. What are the things that you hold that maybe has been through misinterpretation and presumptions and assumptions you've made that we need to talk about. We need to have conversations around, so that work that we need to do around bias and discrimination, prejudice is actually more successful in the long term. And that's particularly important with children. A lot of children come into schools, first being exposed, first of all, to a whole new environment, to being exposed to something so different from what is the norm to them, that they are used to, and often used to hearing comments and statements made about people, places, or attitudes, values that they are actually absorbing, but not necessarily completely holding. So coming to see in a new place like a school, all these differences, all these different people, all these different friends that they can and friendships that they can develop. It's a wonderful space to actually help them re-understand that sense of humanity and belonging that creates the sense of unity that I spoke about earlier. So there have been a number of intercultural competence models, and I'm looking at Deardorf. A lot of Deardorf's work was done around internationalization and students, but she has a number of layers in her model that I think is really useful in everyday life. So she talks about desired external outcomes. How do we behave and communicate effectively? The desired internal outcomes, so adaptability, flexibility, more ethno-relative views, having empathy, knowledge and comprehension. So having our own cultural self-awareness and understanding and knowledge of others, being open to doing that and learning about that, and being prepared to listen, observe, and get the right interpretation of it. But most importantly, to be open to it, to be curious, to want to discover with respect what we see as differences in people. And as part of that, I think communication is important in terms of how we do this and the appreciation of the social norms of others. So, we're not always going to agree about everything that we do or we believe or we listen to or engage in. So we have different worldviews. That's fine. We can agree to disagree, but we can still have a conversation that helps us understand each other on that. Being sociolinguistically aware, being aware of things like verbal and non-verbal communication styles. The differences in interpretation, in meaning making during communication, and the gender positioning in cultures, which sometimes, we may not always agree with, but actually is part and parcel of how that community and society functions. So understanding that will enable us to transcend that a little. Knowledge of social groups and practices, and how we develop skills and interaction. One of the things I often say as an example in this is names. One of the trainings I do is called Call Me By My Name, and it's because when a name is difficult, people revert to what is more manageable for them. So I've heard people tell me, this is my name, and I'm often having it anglicized, given a Western concept of it, because the person says, I can't get my head around your name, but I get my head around their name. So how is that an equal positioning in terms of just something as simple as my identity, my name, which says who I am and what I am? And I think things like that is really important to understand in terms of how it impacts on people's sense of self in a situation where they are the minority and they're part of a majority. Cultural humility in societal practices, I think it's important to see beyond stereotypes, to understand, engage, and learn about other cultures is so important. Stereotypes, I think, actually have a huge impact on how people see the world sometimes. And having an open and respectful approach to other cultures so we can understand, learn, create friendships. And it's a lifelong learning process, and it's a critical self-reflection. It's just sometimes uncomfortable. It doesn't sit well with us, but we all carry prejudices with us. We all have judged something in our time. It is not an issue that happens to one culture or another. We have all done it to each other. So understanding that critical self-reflection is important. And recognizing and challenging power imbalances in terms of those respectful partnership. But I think most importantly, Trevelyan and Murray Garcia said this very well, institutional accountability. How do we hold our institutions to how they create that sense of respectful partnerships? And I bring this back to education, and towards the end of this talk, I'd just like to focus on a generation of hope. The whole intercultural awareness and communication skills are areas I think worthy of exploration, particularly in classrooms, to develop a generation of children and youth that can define that hope, in being invested in peaceful coexistence and societies, and to promote that knowledge, understanding and awareness of diversity within and between communities, and link it to human rights. See it as something that we as a society need to hold dear. An investment in educators, so they're trained and skilled with approaches that enable them to support the intercultural citizenship and rights of others, but most importantly to help with the education of children and youth, because they are now in multicultural, multi-faith classrooms. So our teachers need to be skilled to develop and support young people in terms of not just pedagogy that's sensitive to that, but also helping them grow as young people who take forward as adolescents and adults into the world that sense of community with them. And I end my talk with a reflection that of a quote that I actually very much endorse. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about beloved communities, and there's a wonderful piece of writing that he's done on this. But he said, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. And that is a difficult process for anybody, because it requires a significant self-reflection, a significant questioning of ourselves, who we are, what we are, and how we fit into society, and what we do within that, and a change in how we actually live our lives. And I think his vision of an integrated community was a society where culture, belief, and rights prevailed. And I think all educational spaces and learning communities should be where this is actualized. A blueprint, if you like, for a society that embodies dignity, inclusion, and humanity. So I just want to thank everyone for listening to my talk, and appreciate your time. Thank you.